I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer!
As the story goes, on Christmas 1914, during World War I in the trenches of Belgium, German and English soldiers laid down their weapons, shook hands, and played a game of football in the no man's land between the lines. Historians are unsure if an actual match was played. You can find more on that debate in the show notes, but for today that's neither here nor there. At the very least, on that day, the possibility of football pointed beyond the war. And so, this Christmas 2023, we'll pause our regular conversations with the assistant professor of football. Consider this episode kind of a short audiobook, and consider the question whether football had the last say over war in this story, or whether it didn't, and if it should have. I'll be reading here from the award-winning children's book The War Game by Michael Foreman from 1994. Foreman narrates the story of Freddie, Billy, Lacey and Will, avid soccer-playing teenagers from the English countryside who find themselves caught up in the euphoria of flag-waving patriotism when the war breaks out in 1914. We'll be back by Christmas, they think. By Christmas, however, they are in the muddy trenches as a soccer ball emerges between the battle lines. Whether the story ends in tragedy or in hope remains up to you. Give it a listen. There are two brief breaks in the reading, one for a spiritual song, that's from the Conrad Grebel University Choir in Canada, and one from a brief clip of an animated short film of The War Game. And you will all know the acoustic guitar song right at the end. One current connection on football and war, on top of all the horror in Gaza and in Israel. I learned earlier last week via fans of Werder Bremen in Germany that their friend Inbar Haiman has been murdered. Inbar was a young woman and an active ultra fan of Maccabi Haifa, one of the two big clubs in Israel's second largest city, and one that draws both Jewish and Arab Israelis to its matches. She had been taken hostage by Hamas while attending a music festival on October 7th, and her spots in the stands in Haifa will now remain empty. As much as we wish, football doesn't always have the last word. Nevertheless, Merry Christmas if you celebrate, and happy, refreshing holidays if you don't. The next regular episode of The Assistant Professor of Football is out on January 8th. The kickoff. Goal! Will saw the ball hit the back of the net. In his imagination, he had just scored for England, and he heard the roar of a huge crowd. But he knew that around the playing field there was no crowd, just a low hedge and the familiar flat expanse of the Suffolk countryside. A group of small boys jumped around behind the goal, and a few old men sitting under the elms clapped. The church clock struck 5. The game was over. The two teams changed and joked together. "We'll come back and beat you after the war," laughed someone on the opposing team as they began their walk back to their village 5 miles away. "Most of them are joining the army," said Freddie, the goalkeeper. "We should, really. I'd like to," said Billy, eyes shining with excitement. "No, you're too young. If you went, I'd have to go to look after you," laughed his brother Lacey. "It would be an adventure, though," said Will. "And they say it'll be over by Christmas. Be a pity to miss it." And so they talked as they wandered back along the dusty lane into the village. The summer of 1914 had been one of the hottest ever, and while Will and his friends had worked long and hard in harvest fields, far away, in a place called Sarajevo, an archduke had been killed. The German emperor, Kaiser Bill, was using the confusion as an excuse to start a war and seize territory from his neighboring countries. "So once again, the British army has to go overseas and sort things out," said the old men of the village over their pints of beer. Many of the old soldiers of the village had already been recalled to the army and were on their way to battlefields of France or Belgium. There was a lot of pressure on the young men to follow them. The British army needed many thousands of men to stop the Germans from advancing across Europe. Recruitment posters were everywhere, and the newspapers called on every man to do his duty for king and country. The day after the soccer match was a Sunday, and the vicar boomed out the same message from his pulpit. The local squire in the front pew wore all the medals he could get his hands on, and his son wore a brand new tailor-made officer's uniform. After the service, Will, Freddie, Billy, and Lacey sat by the signpost under the oak and the elm at the corner of the green. Here they had sat almost every day of their lives, after church, after school, and after work. "I think we should join," said Freddie. "None of us has ever been outside the country. It's time we saw something of the world." "Yes, an adventure, and home by Christmas," affirmed Billy. Will wasn't so sure. After all, he thought, a lot of people can get killed in a war. But they agreed that the next day, after work, they would go into town and see what was happening at the town hall, the local army recruiting offices. The adventure. They had never seen such a crowd. There was a great feeling of excitement and even of fun as the flags waved and the band played. Every time a lad went to join up, the crowd gave him a hearty cheer. Before anyone could stop him, Billy was up the steps, and the crowd was cheering him. Then Freddie followed. Lacey had to go to look after Billy. Will knew he couldn't let his friends go off to war without him, so to wild cheers, all four joined the army. They were given railway passes and told to report to barracks in 4 days' time. That evening, when they got home, they had a lot of explaining to do. Being country boys, they were all good shots, and they were assigned to the King's Royal Rifles. It sounded very grand, but so great was the rush to join the army that the army was overwhelmed with recruits and didn't have enough uniforms for them all. Will and the other lads were disappointed and felt foolish learning the basic training and drills wearing their ordinary clothes. They slept in bell tents in a huge field, about a dozen men to a tent. The food was poor, and the days were long and exhausting. However, after a few weeks, they were all outfitted, and the adventure really started. They boarded a converted passenger ferry in Southampton and prepared to set sail at 6 o'clock in a great convoy. The whole of Southampton turned out to see them off. Thousands of sailors cheered and waved their caps from destroyers in Southampton water. As the coast of England faded behind them, Will, like the countless young men crowded around him, felt strangely alone with his thoughts of home and of what lay over the horizon. "Come on, lads, let's have a song," called Freddie. They sang as they sailed, and they felt better. To the front. When they reached France, they were packed into trains which stopped and started and crawled all day along the overcrowded tracks. The country didn't look so different. People worked the fields, just as the lads had back home. Some of the workers unbent their backs and waved as the train went by. The soldiers finally arrived at a small station that had grown into a vast supply depot. Trains and trucks were being shunted and unloaded. Mountains of stores, horse lines, and mule lines were everywhere, and there was a babble of shouted commands. Then, at last, they were off the trains and marching. Will felt good to be out in the fresh air. and swinging along with his mates. Marching through villages and towns, the troops were cheered all the way. Flowers, fruit, and bread were pressed into their arms. It seemed like a pretty good war so far, even though it had begun to rain, and the long, dry summer was over. Then things began to change. The roads became crowded with people moving back from the front. The whole population seemed to be on the move. Families carried their children and pushed baby carriages loaded with whatever they could salvage from their lives. No more cheering crowds. These people had seen war. Their homes had been blown to bits, their farms crisscrossed by armies, trenches and barbed wire, and pockmarked by a million artillery shells. Will could hear the almost continuous sound of shell fire in the distance. They passed wagons full of wounded soldiers on their way back to England, and long lines of exhausted, ragged troops in the mud, rain, and gathering darkness, waiting to be ordered back into the action. At last the marching came to an end, and Will, Freddie, Lacey, and Billy, and the rest of the brigade were ordered onto a fleet of London buses that were to rush them up to the front to fill a gap in the line. They drove through the ruins of a devastated town. The lads had never been to London, yet here they were riding on a London bus in the middle of France. The conductor's bell was still working, and one of the men kept ringing it and shouting, "Next stop, Piccadilly Circus." The glassless windows were covered with boards, but there were plenty of holes to peep through. Will's first reaction was, "Doesn't it look pretty? Just like fireworks." And then they were in the trenches. Not the front trench, but the reserve. In single file, they moved forward along a winding communication trench to the support trench. Here they waited with the sound of battle exploding all around them. There was a lull. "All right, lads, it's our turn," said their sergeant, and in single file and pouring rain, they slogged along another communication trench to the front. The trenches of the Western Front stretched across Belgium and France for a distance of 460 miles. The front trench was about 3 feet wide at the bottom and 7 feet high. To enable the soldiers to fire over or through the parapet, a fire step was built 2 feet high into the forward side of the trench. It was on this that the sentries stood to keep watch. There was still no shooting on this section of the line, as Will and his mates crouched on the fire step to allow wounded and exhausted soldiers to pass by on their way to the rear. No man's land. Will and Freddie were the first to be posted as sentries on their little section, and cautiously they stood up on the fire step. They peered over the parapet into no man's land. They could just see their own first line of barbed wire, and random humps and bumps in an otherwise flat landscape that seeped rapidly into darkness. A landscape as flat as the fields of home. Then a flare arced and spiraled slowly across the sky. Will and Freddie could see that the humps and bumps were men. Dead men. Some of them, who had cut their trousers into shorts during the hot weather, looked like fallen schoolboys. Before the flare faded, Will and Freddie saw more lines of wire and, beyond no man's land, the front line of German trenches. "Less than a goal kick away," whispered Freddie. The newcomers quickly learned a routine of trench life. An hour before dawn every morning, they received the order to stand to. Half asleep and frozen, the men climbed onto the fire step, rifles clutched with numb fingers and bayonets fixed. The half-light of dawn, and at dusk, was when attacks were most expected, and both sides had their trenches fully manned at those times. Sometimes nothing happened. Often there was a furious exchange of rifle and machine gun fire to discourage any attack through the gloom. This was known as morning hate. After an hour or so, the order was given to stand down. Only the sentries remained on the fire step, and the rest of the men enjoyed what breakfast they could get among the rats, blood-red slugs, and horned beetles that infested the trenches. As the weather grew worse, the two huge armies became bogged down in virtually fixed positions. In some places, they were only 30 yards apart, so close that the heavy guns, firing from behind the reserve lines, often killed their own men when shells fell short of their target. The mud became deeper and deeper as thousands of men, mules, horses, and heavy wagons and guns churned it up. Now and then the soldiers were ordered to attack no man's land, even though many lives were always lost and little or nothing was achieved. Small raiding parties ventured out at night to cause as much damage as they could and, if possible, to return with a prisoner or two who could provide some useful information. Other small teams were sent to repair or lay new barbed wire. The covering darkness could be suddenly illuminated at any time by flares. A pistol flare remained bright for about 15 seconds. This seemed an eternity to men lying motionless in no man's land, awaiting the rattle of machine gun fire or a sniper's bullet. The communication trenches were particularly busy at night. Dead and wounded were carried to the rear, and food and munitions were brought to the front. When possible, the dead were recovered from no man's land. Like clearing the table after dinner, ready for the general's next game of soldiers, Will thought. Will often thought of his family, sleeping peacefully just 100 miles away, and of his own bed, dry and warm under the thatched eaves of home. Even his old dog guarding the yard and the pigs in the sty lived in more comfort than Will and the British Army. And still, it rained. The water table of this flat land was often less than 3 feet below the surface. Every shell hole filled with water. The trenches were awash with mud. Here and there, men hollowed out little caves or scrapes in the sides of the trenches to give themselves some protection from the rain, but they found little protection from the high explosive shells that could rain down at any moment. The enemy trenches were so close that whenever fighting died down, each army could hear the other's voices and could sometimes even smell their breakfast. They all knew that they were sharing the same terrible condition. Singing in the trenches was common in 1914, and songs from one front line floated to the other on the quiet evening air. Occasionally, during a quiet period, a British Tommy would put a tin can on a stick and hold it above the parapet to give the Germans some shooting practice. The Germans would do likewise with tin cans or bottles, and a shooting match would develop, accompanied by cheers and boos. Sometimes the soldiers watched rival aircraft challenge each other in mid-air duels over the trenches. Will, Freddie, Lacey, and Billy stayed together as much as possible and lived like soggy moles in a world of mud, attack, and counterattack. The weather, still wet, grew steadily colder. Then, one night as the lads returned to the front after a few days' rest, the rain stopped and it grew bitterly cold. That night, they were relieving a Scottish regiment, and as the Scots left the line, the Germans shouted Christmas wishes to them.
Gib mir den Ball! Na, mach schon!
Move it over here, Fred!
Der Fußball, Tommy! Ja, der Fußball! Will!
It's almost done!
Hoi! I can do that! Ja! Der Fußball!
Then, tiny lights appeared in the German trenches. As far as the eye could see, Christmas trees were flickering along the parapet of the German lines. It was Christmas Eve. A single German voice began to sing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. It was joined by many others. The British replied with The First Noel to applause from the Germans. And so it went on, back and forth across no man's land. And then both front lines sang, Herbei, O ihr Gläubigen, O come, all ye faithful. It was a beautiful moonlit night. Occasionally, a star shell hung like a star of Bethlehem. At dawn, when the British were all stood to on the fire step, they saw a world white with frost. The few shattered trees that remained were white. Lines of wire glinted like tinsel. The humps of dead in no man's land were like toppled snowmen. After the singing of the night, the Christmas dawn was strangely quiet. The clock of death had stopped ticking. Then a German climbed from his trench and planted a Christmas tree in no man's land. Freddie, being a goalkeeper and therefore a bit daft, walked out and shook hands with him. Both sides applauded. A small group of men from each side, unarmed, joined them. They all shook hands. One of the Germans spoke good English and said he hoped the war would end soon because he wanted to return to his job as a taxi driver in Liverpool. It was agreed that they should take the opportunity to bury the dead. The bodies were mixed up together. They were sorted out, and a joint burial service was held on the halfway line. Both sides then returned to their trenches for breakfast. Will and the lads were cheered by the wonderful smell of bacon, and they had a hot breakfast for a change. One by one, birds began to arrive from all sides. The soldiers hardly ever saw a bird normally, but Will counted at least 50 sparrows hopping around their trench. Christmas presents for the men consisted of a packet of chocolate, bouillon cubes, a khaki handkerchief, peppermints, cocoa, writing paper, and a pencil. After breakfast, a pair of horses and a wagon arrived with Princess Mary's Christmas gifts, a pipe and tobacco, and a Christmas card from the King and the Queen. There were no planes overhead, no observation balloons, no bombs, no rifle fire, no snipers, just an occasional skylark. The early mist lifted to reveal a clear blue sky. The Germans were strolling about on their parapet once more and waved to the British to join them. Soon there was quite a crowd in no man's land. Both sides exchanged small gifts. One German had been a barber in Holborn in London. A chair was placed on the halfway line, and he gave haircuts to several of the British soldiers. Then, from somewhere, a soccer ball bounced around the frozen mud. Will was on it in a flash. He trapped the ball with his left foot, flipped it up with his right, and headed it toward Freddie. Freddie made a spectacular dive, caught the ball in both hands, and threw it to a group of Germans. Immediately, a vast, fast and furious soccer match was underway. Goals were marked by caps. Freddie, of course, was in one goal and a huge German in the other. Apart from that, it was wonderfully disorganized. Part football, part ice skating with unknown numbers on each team. No referee, no keeping score. It was just terrific to be no longer an army of moles, but up and running on top of the ground that had threatened to entomb them for so long. And this time, Will really could hear a big crowd. And he was playing for England. He was playing in his usual centre-forward position, with Lacey to his left and little Billy on the wing. The game surged back and forth across no man's land. As the players warmed to the sport, greatcoats and tunics were discarded and the goalposts grew larger. Khaki and gray mixed together. Steam rose from the players' backs and their faces were wreathed in smiles and clouds of breath in the clear, frosty air. Some of the British officers took a dim view of such sport, and when the game came to its exhausted end, the men were encouraged back to their trenches for a carol service and supper. The haunting sound of men singing drifted back and forth across no man's land in the still night air. Good night, Tommies. See you tomorrow. Good night, Fritz. We'll have another game. But the day after Christmas passed without a game. The officers were alarmed at what had happened on Christmas Day. If such friendly relations continued, how could they get the men to fight again? How could the war continue? The men were not allowed to leave the trenches. There were a few secret meetings here and there along the front, and gifts and souvenirs were exchanged. 2 more days passed peacefully. Then a message was thrown over from the German side. A very important general was due to visit their section at 3:15 that afternoon, and he would want to see some action. The Germans, therefore, should start firing at 3 p.m. and the Tommies should please keep their heads down. At 3 o'clock, a few warning shots were fired over the British trenches, and then heavy fire lasted for an hour. The Tommies kept their heads down. At dawn, a few days later, the Germans mounted a full-scale attack. The friendly Germans from Saxony had been withdrawn and replaced by fresh troops from Prussia. They were met by rapid and deadly fire from the British and were forced back. The order was given to counterattack, to try to take the German trenches before they could reorganize themselves. Will and the rest of the British soldiers scrambled over the parapet. Freddie still had the soccer ball. He drop-kicked it far into the mist of no man's land. "They'll give someone a surprise," he said. "Why are football goalies always daft?" thought Will. They were on the attack, running in a line with Will in a center-forward position, Lacey to his left, and young Billy on the wing. From the corner of his eye, Will saw Freddie dive full length, then curl up as if clutching a ball in the best goalkeeping tradition. Daft as a brush, Will thought. Suddenly, they all seemed to be tackled at once. The whole line went down. Earth and sky turned over, and Will found himself in a shell hole staring at the sky. Then everything went black. Slowly, the blackness cleared, and Will could see the hazy sky once more. Bits of him felt hot, and other bits felt very cold. He couldn't move his legs. He heard a slight movement. There was someone else in the shell hole. Will dimly recognized the gleam of a fixed bayonet and the outline of a German. "Wasser! Wasser!" the German whispered. It was about the only German word Will knew. He fumbled for his water bottle and managed to push it toward the German with the butt of his rifle. The German drank deeply. He didn't have the strength to return the bottle. "Kinder?" he asked. "Children?" Will shook his head. The German held up 3 fingers. Will tried to shake his head again to show that he did not understand, but the blackness returned. Later, he saw a pale ball of gold in the misty sky. "There's a ball in heaven," he thought. "Thank God, we'll all have a game when this nightmare is over." At home, when he had a bad dream, he knew that if he opened his eyes, the bad dream would end. But here, his eyes were already open. Perhaps if he closed them, the nightmare would end. And he closed his eyes.